Okay, so good evening and maybe good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Welcome again to one more webinar as part of our Innovation and Precision Eye Health webinar series. My name is Raymond Najjar, and I'm a visual neuroscientist and assistant professor in the Department of Ophthalmology at the National University of Singapore. So today we are really very privileged to have with us a speaker, Professor Catherine Rose from the University of Technology, Sydney, Australia. And for those of you who work on myopia or actually are treating children with myopia, I think Professor Rose don't need any introduction, but I will do it anyway. So Professor Catherine Rose is the head of discipline orthoptics at the Graduate School of Health at the University of Technology, Sydney in Australia. She's a leading international research on the development of vision and refractive errors in children and adolescents. Professor Rose has a particular passion for pediatric eye care. She has a personal research emphasis on the development of ocular structures and functions, particularly in relation to myopia and its prevention, and for vision screening in children. And we all know how much we need myopia prevention in Singapore. Professor Rose has a focus on public health approaches and evidence-based practice in eye health care, and has published over 100 papers and reports in this area. She has extensive international collaborations and has frequently been invited to multiple symposia and documentaries and podcasts. And again, we are very privileged to have you with us tonight, Professor Rose. And thanks for taking the time in the evening to do this and take part of our webinar. So I'll be also joined with Dr. Janice Lam from NUH Ophthalmology. Janice is a collaborator and a colleague in the Department of Ophthalmology. She is a senior consultant at NUH Ophthalmology. So thanks again, Janice. We'll have an interesting discussion at the end around the topic of myopia and behavior change and how can that affect myopia development in children. Without further ado, I think I talked too much already. Professor Rose, thanks again for being with us.
Thank you for welcoming
The stage
me.
is yours.
I'll just share screen. All right, I'm hoping everybody can see my full screen there. Perfect. Okay, so my topic of conversation tonight is prevention of myopia and do we need to change behaviour? And I think this is a topic that we're slowly and surely being dragged towards, sometimes kicking and screaming about how we might have to change behaviour. But I think it is actually still going to be one of the major tools that we're going to use to prevent the epidemic of myopia becoming more entrenched. I have no conflicts of interest to declare, and I'll start by saying, is it lifestyle and behaviour change that has caused the rise in myopia? And it's always worthwhile going back and reminding ourselves of what has led us to this point of understanding about behaviour change and its impact in myopia. And if we look back to some data on the rise of the myopia epidemic, we can actually see that somewhere in the 1970s, there started to be a change, and it was a substantial change across a number of countries in Asia. So Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, less so China, but I'll come to that. So from the 1970s onwards, we saw an increase in myopia, particularly in Southeast Asia and East Asia. And we had to ask ourselves what had changed in that time to affect 15 to 20-year-olds. That's what this data represents. And if we look to Singapore, I think there are two things that we can take into consideration. And the first one is that in 1930s, Singapore had air conditioning introduced, but it became much more common in housing much later, which of course meant in a hot climate, somewhere nice to stay nice and cool. Additionally, in the 1960s, the education system in Singapore changed. And one of the key things that changed was it became academically streamed, and also a 6-day schooling week was introduced. I don't know if that still persists. I haven't asked that particular question, but it is something that potentially was creating a major change in the lifestyle of young children. So the myopia epidemic has continued to rise for a number of decades, and since the 1920s, in some location, myopia prevalence seems to have plateaued, and even in some cases, in particular Taiwan, actually started to slightly subside. But the COVID-19 lockdowns may have temporarily altered that trend, so we may continue to see the impact of that for some time. This story didn't actually quite start in Southeast Asia and Asia. It actually started with the Inuit in Barrow, Alaska. And this was the work by Francis Young, an optometrist, who basically went to Barrow, Alaska, and proceeded to examine the refractive error of 3 generations of families. So there were children, parents, and grandparents. And I've taken an extract from his table to show that while the grandparents actually had no myopia to be recorded, the parents had moderate, mild levels of myopia, 25%. But when you got down to the children, it was a very, very different story. And for those young adults, it again was around that 80+% of myopia. Now, this caused a real stir at the time. And I have to say, poor Francis Young was somewhat disbelieved by the establishment, but he was an optometrist, and I'm sure he did his refractions very well. And I think we can say that his data was sound. And of course, it was a forerunner of what was then to come out, largely of Taiwan and Singapore. There were some interesting observations by Francis Young, and that was that he noted that the current cohort of young myopes didn't appear to be the offspring of older myopes, nor were they, and this, I always find this slightly amusing in our current way of thinking, nor was it accounted for by a sudden influx of white genes. So that was his observation. But he was followed along by Robert Morgan, who was actually an epidemiologist, and I found his observations even more interesting. He noted if the boys leave school earlier or have more frequent and prolonged absences, they would be exposed to less artificial light and more of the bright glare of the Arctic day. And I thought that was a very interesting observation by Robert Moore. And it certainly started me thinking about other factors that might contribute to the development of myopia. And I'm sure those 5 boys out on the ice, I'm sure none of them were myopic. I'm sure they enjoyed the glare of the Arctic day. So when we started to notice a rise in myopia, it was again in Taiwan, Singapore. So there were some surveys conducted in Taiwan between 1983 and 2000, and they show a consistent increase in the prevalence of myopia in children at different time periods at the same age. And this is very interesting. And there's even a suggestion in the later data that, again, we were getting a substantial rise in very young children becoming myopic. So the 7-year-olds had moved from 3% to 20%. And we all know that this is a significant problem in terms of the development of high myopia. Also, there's been a similar rise, but not so dramatic, noticed in the United States. Now, this is the data from the NHANES studies, which are a series of cross-sectional national health studies. So when they compared age groups again, they found between the early 1970s and around the 2000 mark, they'd had an almost doubling of the prevalence of myopia, particularly in the 45 to 54 age group. And they had noticed that it was rising across all of the ages. So this started to bring home the fact that this is not necessarily a unique problem to Asia, that it in fact is something that may be a little bit more general in its effect. Now, the very thing that rapid rise in myopia prevalence told us, that intergenerational change observed by Francis Young and these rapid changes in Taiwan, Singapore, and even that in the USA, it was unlikely that it was genetic change that was occurring, because genes don't change at that rate. So we had this change occurring over a matter of decades. It had to be some kind of change in lifestyle and environment. And there were significant lifestyle changes occurring for both the children in Singapore and in Barrow, Alaska. And these were largely related to spending more time indoors. So we had air conditioning in Singapore, we had lighting and heating occurring in Barrow, Alaska. So these were now nomadic people who were becoming settled into settlements and were getting the benefits of electricity and various other conveniences, and also schooling. So for these children also, schooling was in fact increasing. So it's interesting when you look at this, and I won't go back to that original slide. I always find it interesting that there was a delay in the rise of myopia in China. And that didn't really occur until the 1990s. So it was about 20 years after we saw the changes that were occurring in Alaska, in Singapore, Taiwan. And here, it might be in fact due to the fact that until the 1970s, there was very limited university education. And in fact, some schooling was also heavily disrupted. So again, this is starting to point its way into some very key environmental factors that may be influencing the development of the myopia epidemic. I am going to mention a little bit about parental myopia, because it's often thought again of as largely being genetic in origin, but I think we have to think a little bit more broadly. We do know that two parents who are myopic will very likely to have a child who's also myopic. And we tend to think that this is a genetic transmission. In addition, the rates of heritability for myopia have been reported as very high, but there is a flawed assumption in this story, and that is because families don't just share genes, they also share environments. So it was very likely that two myopic parents would create a myopogenic environment. And when it moved into GWAS studies, so this was 23andMe and the CREAM studies, what was found were a number of variants, but of very small effect. So that sort of holy grail of the myopia gene just didn't appear in these kinds of studies. There's been some recent work from the AUSPAC study, which I find quite interesting. And this is this figure here, where a group with Jez Guggenheim have looked at 7-year-olds and 15-year-olds from the AUSPAC study, and looked at number of myopic parents and also the genetic risk score from GWAS analysis, and looked to see how much it predicted the development of myopia in these children. And basically what they found was that it actually had a very low impact on predicting the rate of myopia in the AUSPAC study. And I've got some personal communication from a study in China that they are finding a very similar result. And in fact, it's actually even less impactful in that particular group. So this is an interesting thought, because I do think parental myopia, we tend to think it's genes, but maybe we've also got to look very carefully at the environment that the myopic parents are creating for their child. Now, that's not to throw all genes out altogether. We know that there are over 250 rare genetic syndromes that are associated with myopia. And it's thought, really looking at a number of different factors, that genes may overall only contribute less than 3% of myopia prevalence in populations. And really where we're starting to see those massive increases up to 80% and beyond, that's really all being environmentally driven. So it's important to understand the significance of the level of the environmental impact on the myopia epidemic. Okay, so let's have a look at the environmental factors that we know are associated with myopia. And over time, there's been a lot that have been looked at, but there are some that have stood strong over time. The biggest one is education. And again, this is data from Singapore. I use this graph to illustrate this very strongly a number of times. It's a very clear indication that the level of education has a dramatic effect on the prevalence of myopia. And this is consistent across the 3 ethnic groups that are in Singapore. So again, it's not associated with just one ethnic group. We're not just talking about susceptibility from one genetic group. We're in fact talking about something that is much more about the location than it is about the ethnicity of the groups that are here. So that was based originally on some visual acuity data, but later refractive data. But I think it shows very clearly a trend that's really been seen through a number of different locations. This is a little bit of data from the Sydney Myopia Study. Now, we don't have high rates of myopia in Sydney, though I was explaining before that we are actually seeing a rise in the number of young children with myopia, starting to flood into paediatric clinics in Sydney in particular. But this is some data from the Sydney Myopia Study, and it looks at the baseline and follow-up study, which was 5 years later. And here we have the younger cohort at baseline, and we're looking at the children who are in what we call opportunity classes. These are actually pre-selective school classes. Children are streamed into these. They're academically selective for high academic achievement and potential. And we can see that even in the schools that are having these classes, there is a significant difference, particularly at the 5-year follow-up when these children were 12, in the number of children who were myopic in the selective schools compared to the comprehensive schools. These selective classes, by the way, are embedded in the comprehensive schools, so they weren't getting different schooling within the school. They were just within those classes, within that school environment. When the children move to high school, they actually do go to academically streamed schools. And again, here we see both at baseline and even more so at age 17 at the end of school, that there is a significant difference between those that are academically streamed into selective schools compared to those who remain in the comprehensive schools. And again, this kind of follows the pattern that we see in a more generalized way, where there's been academic streaming in school environments, creating a greater level of competition amongst largely, I think, parents. And that is driving some level of the development of myopia in children. We have to sort of ask what aspects of education, because the Singapore data was showing the length and the level of education you got to. The data from Sydney was showing streaming, and we actually think it's a combination of everything. So in the 19th century, it was known that increased academic achievement was associated with myopia. That is the work from Cohen in 1886. Where he looked at a range of different academically streamed schools within Germany and saw that those that were at the highest level, which are the gymnasia, actually had much more myopia than the other schools. And you could almost have a gradation based on the level of academic school that the children were attending. So many reports of more myopia at higher education levels, and there also appears a factor that is described as intensive schooling. And that, I think, seems to be related again to when there are very early academic streaming of children and highly competitive parents getting themselves involved in ensuring that their child is streamed into the top academic or as higher academic stream as they can possibly be. If we look at this on a more universal level, countries with high rates of myopia all just about have highly competitive academic streaming school systems. So if we look at the data that is presented in this bottom graph, we can see that the schools across here, or some are actually towns as well as countries, we actually see those that are academically much more successful on the sort of PISA analysis and various other types of analysis, then these children have much higher rates of myopia. We've also noted over the time that these competitive schooling systems tend to encourage early enrolment into schools with an early homework load and academic tutoring outside school time. So these things are all contributing to the factor that is the education level and the duration of education and the intensity of education. But the actual mechanism behind the educational factor, which is remarkably consistent, is still quite unclear. The possibility, of course, is near work. And here we again have a very early prophecy that those who do much close work in their youth become myopic, from Kepler in 1611. So it's very likely that increased educational workload and intensity is associated with more near work. Odds ratio of myopia under a meta-analysis was found to increase by 2% for every additional diopter of near work performed. But again, I don't think that quite necessarily captures what is happening at the very early stages of education. But again, even the mechanism of near work is unclear, because we now know it's not associated with accommodation. And so people are speculating a number of different things about what it is about near work that might be actually contributing to the myopia epidemic. So we can say that higher educational attainment and more years in education will result in somebody performing more near work. Also, we have to remember that hours spent in study and also outside school classes could also restrict available outdoor time. Okay, and the other thing that we have to consider is that high recreational use of digital devices may add to this effect as another form of near work. Now, the story about digital devices is they're not a cause as such. We had a myopia epidemic in Singapore and Taiwan before the World Wide Web actually appeared on the horizon. In fact, it appeared on the horizon some 20, 25 years later than the first rises in myopia that were noted in these countries. And really, the use of tablets and smartphones and computers is a very much more recent phenomena. So it doesn't really say why we had things like 80% myopia in 18 to 20-year-olds back in the even 2000 era. And I know it's very hard. I was talking to a class actually only yesterday and explaining that when I did my PhD, there was no such thing as a tablet or a laptop. It was a very clunky computer that had a rate of speed that was diabolical, but we got there. So we have to accept that We don't need digital devices to create a myopia epidemic. However, I do think that we have to take this into consideration. Now, there have been quite a number of studies that have tried to look at the relationship between digital devices and myopia, and they haven't been very successful. Many are not using cycloplegic refraction, or they're using inadequate cycloplegia, which is going to confound their analysis. And they tend to gather the data by questionnaire, so it's unlikely to reveal a true association. A recent review of 15 studies that use cycloplegia found mixed results across those 15 studies, and recommended that there had to be more objective measures of screen time to try and tease out whether there was an independent effect from digital devices. There is a recent study that looked at a smartphone recorded data usage and coupled that with questionnaires, and found an association between myopia and smartphone data usage, but not with self-reported duration of usage. But it's important to note that not all use of things like smartphones are necessarily going to have the person glued to the screen, because not all high data streaming services, such as music apps, necessarily involve eye contact or close proximity of the device, but they will be, of course, recorded as data usage. So we've got to find more objective ways of looking at digital devices to try and tease out if they have a significant effect or not. But they are certainly most likely a form of near work that may be additive to things like schooling and study and recreational reading. Okay, let's now have a look at some environmental factors that we know prevent myopia. And really, the one that stands out here is outdoor time. And I'm going to take you through very quickly the Sydney Myopia Study data, which I'm sure you've seen many times before. But I always kind of say to people, the really important thing to take away from this data is that if you couple low outdoor time with high near work, you increase your odds of becoming myopic by age 12 by 2.6 times. However, if you look at these children doing high levels of near work per week in that pale yellow column and follow the arrow to the bottom one, here we've got the children doing high levels of near work, but also doing high levels of outdoor time. And these children are not susceptible to myopia. So this is starting to point to some kind of level of interaction between myopia and the balance between near work and outdoor time. In addition, in this particular paper, we hypothesized that high light levels outdoors would stimulate the release of retinal dopamine, which was a known eye growth inhibitor. And this, in fact, could be one of the major mechanisms by which we were getting excessive axial elongation and therefore increases in myopia. Now, I still read in some papers that the mechanism is not known, but the mechanism is known. And that is because of some very good work by Frank Schafel and Regan Ashby, which was in Germany, where they basically looked at this in animal models. And it's long been known that if you deprive an eye of form stimulation visual form stimulation during early development, the eye excessively axial elongates, and this is known as form deprivation myopia. So what Regan Ashby and colleagues did was they found that the form deprivation myopia, so these are chickens wearing goggles, very attractive, were exposed to bright light, that this in fact inhibited the development of myopia that normally occurred with form deprivation. Another critical thing to remember from this is that just by chance, the lights that they used were actually UV free. So that also started to rule out a role for UV radiation in the development of myopia. They then took that study one step further, and what they did is they then blocked the dopamine effect by a dopamine antagonist known as biparone, and then found that the protective effect of the bright light disappeared. And that actually implicates very much retinal dopamine in the excessive elongation and its role in bright light protecting from the development of myopia. Now, these are animal models, and people can say, how applicable are they to humans? A similar thing was found by Earl Smith in monkeys. He didn't take it to the level of the spiparone effect. But interestingly, also, Karuta and Ashby found a dose-response effect, and they took the light levels up above the 10,000 lux mark and found that by the time they got to about 40,000 lux, it was effectively blocking form deprivation myopia. And I think this is actually going to be quite applicable to what we actually know also about human myopia and its development. So increased outdoor times has been consistently shown to prevent myopia. There are 2 studies, if you really go hunting, that have exceptions to this, but it can be explained by their sampling. I won't go to that in detail at the moment. Jones and colleagues from the Orinda and Clear studies also showed that even if a child had 2 myopic parents, increased time playing sport, which was likely to be mostly outdoors, was also protective. And we also demonstrated in the Sydney myopia study that the protective effect of being outdoors was not related to physical activity. Even if the child was lolling about in the sun, that was fine. That protected them. And in fact, leisure time outdoors was as protective as playing sport outdoors. And conversely, indoor sport was not protective at all. So again, that removed the physical activity component from what was occurring in the outdoor environment. The Sydney myopia study follow-up, this is again now our people who were 12 at baseline, now age 17. And again, we see exactly the same pattern occurring. High levels of near work and low level of time outdoors nearly increased your odds of developing myopia by 5 by the time you were 17. Again, high near work was still offset by time outdoors, while the most protective behaviour was still high outdoor time and low near work time. And this data from the Sydney myopia cohort showed that incident myopia at age 17 was related to both the time spent outdoors and time spent in near work at age 12. So that early behaviour was predicting the development of myopia in these children at 17. This is some further analysis, which I particularly like, from my colleague, Amanda French. And Amanda decided that she would look about the balance between near work and time outdoors. So the larger of the 2 graphs that we're looking at first is the baseline refraction amongst children at age 12. And we have the mean spherical equivalent at age 12 was plus 0.49. And what you can see is there's virtually a crossover at that point with the children who are becoming more myopic. The more myopic you were, the more out of balance you were in terms of spending time in near work and time outdoors. If you were on the hyperopic side of life, you virtually had the 2 things in balance. And I think that was a really important illustration of how we're starting to think that time outdoors and near work are interacting with each other, and that it's not so much that you have high levels of near work, it's much more about that you offset it with equal amounts of time spent in outdoor environments. This actually persisted into the follow-up refraction at age 17. And again, we think that this is an important aspect of advice that you can give to parents about the behaviour of their children. Now, the next thing that crops up is, oh, but it's not safe to be outdoors. You can get sunburnt, you know, long-term UV radiation. You can cause all these kinds of problems with your eyes included, as well as skin. But we've already got a very large hint from the work from Frank Schafel and Regan Ashby that light intensity, not UV, is actually what is the important thing. A lot of people don't appreciate that most sunglasses actually prevent UV radiation, not so much glare. So when you actually look at the highest level of glasses that prevent UV radiation, and this is this graph here below, this actually shows quite clearly that you can still get reasonable levels of light or glare coming through those particular glasses. And the only ones that perhaps are in fact causing some difficulties are those that are usually worn for medical reasons with very high glare reduction. But even in part of the day, you're still getting light levels around the 20,000 lux mark. The hours that you need to spend outdoors are conservatively set at around 11 to 15 hours per week outdoors. And that's really just been based on observation from cross-sectional and longitudinal cohort studies. And it's remarkably consistent across a range of studies. I often get asked about wearing hats, being in the shade. Even on a cloudy day, am I getting enough, sunlight? And the answer to that is yes, you are. People don't often appreciate the huge difference between indoor light levels and outdoor light levels, even on a cloudy day, even standing under the shade of a tree. Maximum indoor light levels rarely go to 1,000 lux. They mostly sit around about 350,000 lux. Trust me, I and many of my students have walked around with light meters of making multiple observations of this. When you go outdoors, even on a cloudy day, it could be 30 times that. You could be looking at 30,000 lux. That's not unusual. And as you can see in our control data, and this wasn't actually the brightest recording we got, on a Sydney day, during the middle of the day, we were up around 180,000 lux. Our actual highest recording, which was a midsummer's day, was 310,000 lux in the direct sunlight. So again, I say to parents, we've stood under shade, doesn't matter, you're still getting high levels of outdoor light. It is actually quite remarkable, the difference in lighting between indoor and outdoor environments. If you've not walked around with the light meter, try it sometime. Now, there have been some intervention studies based around time outdoors. The first one is the GOAL study from Guangzhou, where there were 12 Guangzhou schools matched by visual acuity data, which they'd been collecting over a large period of time. So that was a surrogate for the level of myopia in the schools. And then they had random allocation to a control and intervention arm. They increased outdoor time by 40 minutes per school day. And they, over a 3-year period, they noticed a significant difference in mean spherical equivalent and in the incidence of myopia amongst the intervention and control schools. The change in axial length approached significance, but didn't quite get there. And there's some real issues around using axial length as a surrogate for refractive error in young children, which is a long story, which I will not get into just right at the moment. But just let's say, I think if you're going to look for effects, you really got to measure the refraction. You can measure axial length too, but understand at that young age, the crystalline lens is losing optical power, which will actually compensate for the refractive effect of increased axial elongation. So, and when you actually look at myopic children, that effect has disappeared, and all of a sudden 1 millimeter increase in axial length will equal about 3 diopters in refraction. So you will always get an amplified effect when you look at the refractive data as opposed to the axial length data. The other study that is well known here is the ROC studies, and this is from Pei-Chong Wu in Taiwan, and he conducted the initial studies over 1 year, and he increased the time outdoors to 80 minutes. So he doubled it compared to the goal study, and that gave an average of about 11.2 hours per week, which is starting to get up to the level that the cross-sectional studies and longitudinal studies was suggesting might be where we might be getting the protective effect. So there was more outdoor time than the goal study, and there was a greater reduction in incident myopia. It more than halved in the ROC group compared to the control group. And that is very consistent with what we would expect. So this was only in 1 year, where the ROC goals was 3 years. So there is something about a threshold level of time outdoors that is important. And I think we're talking well and truly in the region of 11 hours up. One of the interesting things about the program in Taiwan, it's now become an official program called Tien Tien 120. This is some data from Pei-Chong Wu, which is based on visual acuity data. They've been measuring visual acuity in these schools for a very long time. And here we're looking at children aged 7 to 12 years, and we're looking at the abnormal visual acuity being a surrogate for myopia. And this is data from those schools that were participating in the ROC program. And it started, Tien Tien Outdoors started around late 2010. And within about 2 years, they started to notice a drop in abnormal visual acuity in those schools. And they are attributing that directly to a reduction in myopia as well as an improvement in visual acuity, which is nice as well, but it's most likely a reduction in myopia to the outdoor activities that the children were taking for 120 minutes per day in school. Just a little look at COVID-19 and environmental factors and their impact on myopia. I've done quite a lot of analysis here, but I will just look at the incident myopia effects. Again, a large number of studies, but not all of them actually have used cycloplegic refraction, and some also have not been very good in their measures of behaviours. So there are a limited number of studies that really gave us some significant clues. So first of all, this is some data from University of Oxford, which is freely available, that looked at the stringency of lockdowns in different locations across the world. And our first lockdowns occurred in China, in the Hubei province, in January 2020. And you can see from this data that China really moved into heavy lockdowns quite significantly by August 2020. So the kinds of changes that the lockdowns introduced into lifestyle was an increased level of near work at home, large component of which was leisure activity, not just schooling, but actually using near work in leisure time. Increased digital screen time and online learning, decreased time outdoors most definitely. But it's always interesting, again, a lot of people reported things about increased or high use of digital devices. But what they didn't take into account was that, in fact, computer use and online learning was occurring in schools pre-pandemic, but they didn't factor that into their analysis. So it's, again, are the digital devices doing it? You know, it really leaves that question still open. And the other one is, I particularly like this second photograph because it also very clearly shows that not all online learning was near work. And in fact, this was quite a common practice. Children were using TV screens at a greater distance than computers and tablets. So there was mixed behaviour changes. So there were multiple reports, mainly out of China and Hong Kong, and these were coupled with significant decreases in time outdoors and less physical activity. Of interest, one of the studies found that students using televisions and projectors, as I said, for online learning, had significantly less myopia than those using tablets and mobile phones, again implicating digital device or near work. I think, again, potentially near work. One study of preschool children in Taiwan found no myopic shift in COVID-19 and concluded that was in fact due to being part of that myopia control program that encouraged outdoor activity during school daytime. So the two studies I've chosen here are prospective longitudinal studies, one in Guangzhou and one from Hong Kong, that had both pre-COVID and COVID exposed cohorts. So they were looking, first of all, in Guangzhou, they were looking at the pre-COVID rate or incidence of myopia, and noticed during COVID exposure in a similar grade, they were actually getting a doubling again of the incident myopia during the COVID lockdown. And similarly, a study from Hong Kong, again, looking at two cohorts of a similar age, found that the incidence of myopia, and note that this one's over a 3-year period, whereas was a 36.6%, but they also noticed that in over 8 months, they got an incidence of 19.4%. And they used a relative risk regression model that found that the incidence of myopia was higher in the COVID exposed group than in the previous pre-COVID groups. So these studies give some very clear indications that the changes in lifestyle that were occurring during COVID were in fact myopogenic. And we can probably reasonably confidently say that one of the major factors was less time outdoors and probably also greater exposure to near work. So we can say that time outdoors is protective for myopia. We can say that near work may be an independent risk factor for myopia, but that it's highly modulated by the amount of time spent outdoors, and really you have to have those in balance. The COVID-19 lockdowns demonstrated an extreme lack of time outdoors, and high near work had a negative impact on the development of myopia in children. But I still think that the role of digital devices is undetermined, and we have questions about whether they carry an inherent risk, or are they just another form of near work? Are they substituting for available time outdoors, or is it a combination of both? And I suspect it's a combination of both those factors. We know that controlling myopia is important at a young age. And we know this because if children are becoming myopic at age 6, we can predict that they will have high myopia by the time they're 11 and 12. Whereas if you have an onset of myopia at age 12, you are likely to enter or maybe even avoid developing myopia at the -5 diopters as an adult. So that age of the onset is actually very important. So we then ask, do we need to change behaviours? Because if we're implicating environment, then we need to potentially modify environment, particularly changing it back to something that we had before. In other words, where children spent a lot more time outdoors and early academic streaming and intensive schooling was not the norm. So from a public health perspective, prevention is key. I know we now have a number of treatments for slowing myopia progression, but I think we all have to adopt the mantra of preventing myopia, particularly in young children. Time outdoors is simple, cost-effective way to prevent and delay onset. It's also likely to confer other health benefits, such as lowering obesity, reducing diabetes in populations. So we are talking about something that is not going to endanger their health. And if we know that the children can wear UV protection and not be in direct sunlight, then we're not really putting them at any kind of immediate risk by suggesting that time outdoors might be a healthy thing for them. We don't know the precise duration and frequency, but there's a consistent evidence that about 2 hours per week is actually important. And measures can be undertaken to lessen that UV radiation. And time spent in near work should be in balance with the time spent outdoors. So how do we change behaviour? Well, the most effective strategy has been outdoor programs through schools, including outdoor tasks in school curricula and providing scope for outdoor activities in recess times. And that's really what the Ministry of Education in Taiwan's Tien Tien 120 program does. There was a program in Singapore, which was Kids for Nature, encouraging time spent in Singapore national parks for primary school children and parents, but the compliance declined after the initial 6 months where it was very well taken up. In China, the government's recent double reductions policy aimed at reducing homework and after-school tutoring indirectly will facilitate opportunities for increased time outdoors and less near work, but we await to see the impact of that. It may take a few years to emerge yet. Parental concerns about having a negative effect on school performance can in part be addressed by some recent data from the STORM study in Shanghai, which their data suggested in a cross-sectional analysis that increased outdoor time actually might have had a positive effect on improving academic performance. And I think that's a space to keep an eye on, because there's actually also quite a bit of data from educational data that also suggests things like creative play, which is often outdoors, also increases academic performance in children and their capacity to retain and pay attention for longer periods of time. So the role of us as eye care professionals is to advocate both with parents, but perhaps more importantly with governments and ministries of education, that changes in emphasis of schooling system to achieve a better balance between study and outdoor time will be important for all of our children's eye health. And we don't think that this is necessarily going to have some hugely detrimental effect on educational outcomes. And in fact, what it might do, in fact, is in the long run, make things better for children moving through the schooling systems. I think in Australia, preschool, kindergarten is still very much about social development, not so much about educational development, despite pressure from some parents. And I think this has saved, in part, Sydney, Australia and wider Australia from myopia epidemic, along with our environment that allows good time spent outdoors, and also our emphasis on sporting prowess. We're very fond of that. So that's regarded as a very important part of social development for young children. So these are factors that I think are protecting us, but for how long, as there are increasing pressures from parents about the success of their children within the academic environment. Okay, I'm open to questions.
I think this is the largest attendance we've had in terms of participants. We're around 522 now. So thanks again. And I would like to invite our panelists, Dr. Janice Lam and Dr. Soon Chen Singh from NUH Ophthalmology to join for this discussion. We already have 19 questions, so I apologize already to some of the participants that we may not be able to take all of them, but we will be able to take at least a few and addresses.
Can you bear with me for 2 seconds? I think my computer's about to run out of power.
Sure.
Bear with me.
Sure, no problem. I guess we can maybe answer a couple of questions. Maybe Janice Chen Sing, I think this is a question directly for you. Which age is more prone to myopia? I think we can spare Prof. Rose this question. Which age is more prone to myopia? That's from the participants.
Vincent, do you want to take that?
Yes, please, Janice. Yeah.
So the range actually coincides with the growth of the child. So the myopia progression that we see in Singapore progressed the most from between about, say, 6 years old to about 12 years old. Beyond 12, there's still some progression, but usually it's not as quick as those.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Jensing. I think we'll get back to Prof. Rose. I just have a quick question also from the audience, also from me. We talk about time outdoors and myopia prevention. What about in children who already have myopia? Is there a proof or is there a benefit from going outdoors?
Yeah. This is a constant question to which we don't have the exact answer. I didn't include this data. We have never seen why there would be a biological interruption to a biological process as soon as you tipped over minus 0.5 diopters. So it was kind of an interesting fact that when we looked at most sort of longitudinal and cross-sectional studies, we either found that the myopic children were already doing what I would describe as sub-threshold behaviours. So they already were not performing at a level in outdoor time that would actually give them any protection. So then we looked to the intervention studies, but again, that was difficult because we, again, didn't, except for the Tien 120 study, actually get sufficient levels of protection. And Pei Chung Wu has reported that there is a reduction in myopia progression with that level of outdoor time. I'm sorry, my internet is going a bit slow and I'm sort of falling behind my speech, but I'll keep going. The key information that it does play a role in myopia progression are two things. There are consistent reports of seasonal variations in myopia progression amongst myopic children. And these come from a range of different locations and a range of different studies, some in China, some in the US, where it's known that during summertime, there is a much slower rate of myopia progression than seen in the winter months. So that's the first thing. The second thing that actually also was very interesting, there is one report from the dim spectacles where they found that the protective effect from the dim spectacles almost disappeared during COVID. And that again would implicate that the dim spectacles were actually being supplemented by some level of time outdoors. And I think that's probably an area where we can continue to look. So if you are treating children who are already myopic, I would not leave outdoor time out of the mix that you're giving them for controlling their myopia.
Excellent. Janice, any questions from your side, please?
Oh, great. So I think, Prof. Rose, that excellent talk. It's been so informative. I really thank you. I've been a fan of your work, and I think Tien Tien will say the same. So I think there was this common question within the Q&A segment that talked about what are your thoughts about, doing near work outdoors or reading outdoors? How does that impact myopia incidence and myopia progression? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, number one, if it's a digital device, it's actually very difficult to use a digital device in full sunlight. So reading a book is even also quite difficult, particularly in our very bright sunny days, very difficult. If the sunlight's not too bad, then they can actually read quite easily. I suspect what they're getting is a nice balance of outdoor time and near work. And, you know, I also go back to the fact that we noticed that leisure time for children outdoors was just as protective as playing sport. And a lot of that leisure time was, okay, talking to family and having a picnic or a barbecue, but it was also children just spending some time playing with, things outside or reading outside. So I think that's quite acceptable behaviour that you encourage, as long as the light's not too bright, because the glare off a page and the glare off a screen will really make it difficult for them if it's a really bright sunny day.
Thanks, Prof. That sounds really logical. And I mean, it really depends on how comfortable they are reading outdoors, isn't it?
Yes.
And that balance of near work and outdoor time is so important.
Yeah.
Let's see. We are about time now. Are we able to answer any more questions?
I think we can take
I think you can have
2 or 3 more questions. Yeah, additional questions. Tien Tien, do you have any question from your side, please?
Yes, I do. So, Prof, like Jenny said, I've been a great fan of your work, and your the WHO recommended 2 hours of outdoor time from the basis of your excellent work, and
Thank you.
we have been promoting that as well. The question, I think one of the audience also asked. Oh, hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes. So a lot of the epidemiology studies are all based on surveys and questionnaires that is based on parental recall. So there are newer devices that attempt to measure objectively the near work and outdoor time, such as devices from Cloudflip from China. Prof. Sosia may also try to use a watch-based light meter. So what's your take on further research on having children wearing a wearable tracker to track their behavior instead of relying on questionnaires?
So I'm sorry, I lost you a little bit at the end there, but I think what you're asking is about the current devices that are there to measure light objectively, and the Cloudflip, which measures both light and also reading distance. And I think there's another device that's quite new that is doing something very similar, also out of China. I think they're an excellent way to objectively measure. We did extensive work, as was done by Sieng Mei Saw in Singapore, on using hobo light meters, which proved to have enormous problems in wearability. We did quite extensive work on the best location for locating light meters too, because you get things like sleeves coming down over watches and various things. And I know that we found that an armband worn high on the arm with a sort of like a iPad sort of, not an iPod pocket with the light meter in it was actually the best option. So I think objectively measuring light is useful, but I think also we're going to have to think about the timing of light. And this has been a topic of discussion, because we actually know that retinal dopamine needs about 10 minutes of sunlight to reach kind of maximum level, and then decays quite slowly in the retina over time. And it may turn out that shorter periods, more frequent shorter periods of time outdoors might be even better than a big slab of time, such as 2 hours in a day. But again, that can be quite difficult to construct into a child's day. So I think we have to be relatively practical about what we can actually design into programs to prevent myopia within schools.
Yeah. Thanks, Tien Tien. Thanks, Prof. I think that one last question, because I saw a redundancy in the Q&A for that question. What about having the children sit indoors next to a window that is filtering UV? Obviously, most windows, all windows actually filter UV, or increasing light intensity in rooms or in houses or in classrooms. Can that be helpful?
Well, I can tell you again from the light meter data that you just about have to have your nose pressed up against the glass to start to get about 20,000 lux. And it only takes a very short distance away from the window before it actually starts to drop very significantly. So, okay, on a very bright sunny day with a window that's facing north, with you sitting quite close to the window, you might get something like 20,000, might even get 30,000 lux. But that's not the typical situation that we have, particularly in schools. Bright lights, the problem with the bright lights, of course, is that they generate heat. And so we've quickly worked out that if you wanted to get 30,000 lux in a classroom, the amount of air conditioning that you would have to actually provide to bring the room down to a reasonable temperature is very significant. And that's even using low heat generating LED type lights. Probably the best option I've seen, which I saw a young researcher develop in Canada, was a 10,000 lux personal light, which actually was quite comfortable to sit near. It had its own fan system. But that's never really gone into commercial development because it was quite an expensive light to actually create with the appropriate cooling. By the way, it was also fantastic if you were presbyopic. You could read very much more easily with 10,000 lux on the page.
Excellent. So I guess, unfortunately, we will have to, this session has to come to an end. I think we still have a lot of questions, but unfortunately, the time has run out. So once again, thanks a lot, Professor Catherine Rose, for taking the time to talk to us tonight about behavior changes and myopia, and more importantly, outdoor times and myopia. So I guess the final message is to trying to encourage outdoor time as much as possible, whether
Yes.
it be from the parents, from the government, from the schools, or from the ministries, right? So this is, that's
the message to parents.
That's a message to parents, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so with that, thanks again, Prof. Rose, Dr. Sun, and Dr. Lam for this webinar, and thanks a lot to all our participants. And we'll see you on the next webinar, which will be on the 9th of April, with Prof. Omar Maru, and the topic of inherited retinal diseases, approach to patients, and the top genes. So with that, good evening, everybody, and thanks again for this excellent webinar session, Prof. Rose.